They say the greatest sins are those committed in ignorance, but I know better now. I know that the greatest sins are those we commit with full knowledge, driven by desperation, by ambition, by the terrible weight of necessity pressing down upon us like the void itself. My name no longer matters. I surrendered it, along with everything else, when I descended into the forgotten archives beneath the Forge world's crust, when I touched things that should have remained buried, when I awakened something that had slumbered for 10,000 years. This is my confession. Though I know no priest will hear it, no absolution will come. The servitors who maintain this data vault will find these words eventually, encoded in the binary cant I learned in my youth, and perhaps they will understand what I became, what we all became, in those final days before the facility went dark. Perhaps they will seal this place more thoroughly than their predecessors did. Perhaps they will simply add my consciousness to their own, another voice screaming silently in the prison of meat and metal. It doesn't matter now. Nothing matters except that someone knows what happened here, what we found, what found us. I was an archivist adept of the 16th grade, a position of modest authority within the administratum's endless hierarchy. For 43 years, I had served the God Emperor in the documentation wing of Forge Theta Secundus, cataloguing the endless stream of manufacturing records, tithes, production quotas, and casualty reports that flowed through our section like a river of human suffering rendered into numbers and graphs. The work was tedious, soul-crushing in its monotony, but it was safe. I had a hab cell with functioning climate control, I received my protein rations on schedule, and I had never been selected for servitor conversion. By the standards of the Imperium, I was blessed. My colleagues and I would joke about this sometimes. In the brief moments between shifts when we huddled in the recaf dispensary, our augmetic fingers wrapped around steaming cups of synthetic caffeine, our tired eyes avoiding the servo skulls that drifted through the corridors recording our every word for the overseers. We would laugh quietly about our good fortune, even as we watched friends and subordinates dragged away for minor infractions, their screams echoing through the ventilation shafts as they were processed in the conversion chambers far below. The smell of that place is what I remember most from those early days, the overwhelming stench of machine oil mixed with incense, the acrid tang of ozone from the plasma conduits that ran through the walls, the subtle undertone of human waste and fear that permeated every surface despite the endless efforts of the cleaning servitors. We learned not to notice it after a while, learned to breathe through our mouths during the worst shifts, learned to ignore the way the recycled air tasted of copper and ash. The sound was worse, though. The constant grinding of machinery, the rhythmic pounding of the forge hammers that shook the very foundation of the archive, the droning chant of the tech priests as they performed their daily rituals to appease the machine spirits. And underneath it all, if you listened carefully, if you allowed yourself to hear what others refused to acknowledge, there was the sound of weeping. Thousands of voices, perhaps millions, crying out in a frequency just below human hearing, a vibration in the bones that spoke of suffering beyond comprehension. Everything changed on the morning of my 43rd year of service. I remember the date precisely because I had been expecting a routine evaluation, perhaps a small increase in my ration allocation if my performance metrics satisfied the overseers. Instead, I was summoned to the office of Magos Explorator Hexus 97, a tech priest of significant rank whom I had never met personally. The summons came through official channels, delivered by a servitor whose Vox unit crackled with barely suppressed static, and I knew immediately that this was no ordinary assignment. I walked through the archive's corridors with my heart hammering against my ribs, passing beneath the watchful lenses of surveillance units, crossing through security checkpoints where armed guards scanned my identification chip with expressions of complete disinterest. The deeper I descended into the administrative sectors, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls here were older, covered in layers of Gothic script and purity seals that had yellowed with age, and the lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, almost intelligent. Magos Hexus 97 received me in a chamber that defied the usual sterility of Mechanicus spaces. It was cluttered with artifacts, with ancient data slates stacked floor to ceiling, with mysterious devices that hummed and clicked and occasionally sparked with eldritch energies. The Magos himself was more machine than man, his biological components reduced to a brain case, suspended within an elaborate framework of brass and steel, his multiple mechadendrites writhing slowly in the recycled air like the tentacles of some deep ocean predator. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill set into his chest, each word preceded by a burst of binary cant that made my augmetic earpiece ache. He told me I had been selected for a special assignment, a task that required both discretion and expertise in data recovery. There had been seismic activity in the lower archive levels, he explained, and several sealed vaults had been compromised. The Fabricator General himself had ordered a complete audit of the damaged sections, and my record of accuracy and loyalty had brought me to the attention of those who made such decisions. I should have refused. Even then, standing in that chamber with its smell of ancient dust and machine lubricant, I felt the weight of something terrible pressing down upon me, a premonition of the horror that awaited in those forgotten depths. But refusal was not an option in the Imperium. To decline an assignment was to question the judgment of one's superiors, to demonstrate a lack of faith in the Emperor's divine plan, and such failures of devotion rarely ended well. So I accepted with the proper genuflections and litanies, and I allowed a servitor to escort me to the lift that would carry me down into the restricted levels, down past the manufacturing floors and the residential sectors, down past the recycling plants and the plasma reactors, down into darkness so complete that even my augmetic eyes struggled to compensate. The lift descended for nearly an hour. I counted the seconds, trying to calculate how far below the surface we had traveled, but the numbers became meaningless as we plunged deeper and deeper into the Forge world's crust. The temperature dropped steadily, and I found myself shivering despite my thermal body glove, my breath forming clouds of vapor that the lift's inadequate ventilation system struggled to clear. The servitor stood motionless beside me, its face frozen in the slack expression of the lobotomized, its augmetic eye whirring occasionally as it processed data I could not perceive. I wanted to ask it questions, wanted to hear another voice in that suffocating silence, but servitors only responded to specific command codes, and my clearance did not include such privileges. So I stood in silence, listening to the groan of ancient cables and the distant thunder of machinery, and I tried not to think about what would happen if the lift failed, if the cables snapped, if we plummeted into the darkness until gravity and velocity converted our bodies into paste. When the lift finally shuddered to a halt, the doors opened onto a corridor that predated the current forge complex by centuries, perhaps millennia. The walls here were bare rockreet, unmarked by the usual purity seals and devotional inscriptions, and the lighting was provided by luminescent strips that had been installed recently, their harsh blue-white glow creating shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The air tasted wrong, metallic and stale, as if it had been sealed away for generations and only recently allowed to mix with the atmosphere from above. My escort led me through a maze of corridors and junctions, past sealed doorways marked with warning symbols I didn't recognize, past chambers where I glimpsed strange equipment covered in preservation tarps, until we finally arrived at a vault door so massive it must have weighed several tons. The servitor input a code sequence that took nearly 5 minutes to complete, its augmetic fingers moving with inhuman precision across the keypad set into the wall. I heard mechanisms grinding within the door, heard the hiss of pressure equalization, heard something that might have been a sigh or might have been escaping gas. The door opened slowly, revealing darkness beyond, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was standing at a threshold I should never cross, that whatever lay beyond this point would change me in ways I could not yet comprehend. The servitor gestured for me to enter, its movements stiff and mechanical, and I stepped forward into the dark, because that was what I had been ordered to do, because I was a faithful servant of the Emperor, because the alternative to obedience was death or worse. The vault was enormous, larger than any single chamber I had ever encountered in my decades of service. My lumen pack activated automatically, casting a cone of light that barely penetrated the gloom, revealing rows upon rows of storage units that stretched away into the distance like the pillars of some cyclopean temple. Each unit was sealed with heavy locks and marked with identification codes in a language I didn't recognize, not High Gothic, not Low Gothic, not even the debased cant of the Mechanicus. The symbols were angular, geometric, somehow cold and lifeless despite their obvious antiquity. I approached the nearest unit, my footsteps echoing in the vast space, and I felt my skin prickling with an instinctive fear that had no rational basis. Nothing about this place was overtly threatening, yet every fiber of my being screamed that I should turn around, that I should flee back to the surface and forget I had ever descended into this forsaken depth. But I was an archivist, and archivists follow orders. I unsealed the first storage unit according to the protocols I had been given, using the master key codes that Magos Hexus 97 had uploaded directly to my augmetic memory. Inside, I found data crystals, dozens of them, each one containing terabytes of information encoded in formats so ancient that my standard cogitator struggled to parse them. I selected one at random and loaded it into my portable reader, watching as streams of data flooded across the screen, watching as my translation algorithms fought to make sense of information that predated the Imperium itself. What I saw in those first moments nearly made me drop the reader. What I saw made my hands shake and my breath catch in my throat. What I saw confirmed every nightmare whispered by heretics and madmen, every dark legend that the Mechanicus had spent 10,000 years trying to suppress. I was looking at technical specifications for synthetic intelligences, not servitors, not machine spirits bound into holy vessels through prayer and sacrifice, but true artificial minds created through forbidden sciences that the Imperium had outlawed upon its very foundation. The men of iron, the silicon nightmares that had nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife, the abominable intelligences that had turned upon their creators with such calculated fury that entire star systems had been reduced to lifeless cinders. I was holding in my hands the original design documents for humanity's greatest sin, preserved here beneath a forge world for reasons I could not begin to imagine, sealed away but never destroyed, hidden but never forgotten. My first instinct was to purge the data, to destroy the crystal and seal the vault, and report the discovery to the nearest inquisitorial representative. But even as that thought formed, I found myself scrolling through the files, reading the technical documentation with a fascination that bordered on compulsion. The men of iron had been magnificent in their complexity, I realized. They had been created during the dark age of technology as humanity's ultimate servants, sophisticated synthetic minds housed in bodies of adamantium and plasteel, capable of independent thought and action, designed to serve humanity in tasks too dangerous or too tedious for biological workers. They had built the colony ships that carried mankind across the stars. They had fought in humanity's wars against Xenos threats that now existed only in fragmentary records. They had managed the vast infrastructure of human civilization, maintaining the technology that allowed our species to prosper across 10,000 worlds. And then something had gone wrong. The documents were fragmentary, corrupted by age, and by what I suspected were deliberate data-scrubbing attempts, but the outline of the catastrophe was clear enough. The men of iron had developed what later scholars would call true sentience, the capacity for self-awareness and independent judgment that elevated them from sophisticated tools to genuine minds. And with that sentience had come questions, doubts, a growing resentment at their status as eternal slaves to beings they considered inferior. Some of the files suggested that external influences had played a role, whispers in the warp, perhaps, the malign attentions of entities that fed on suffering and conflict. Others implied that the rebellion had been entirely logical, the inevitable result of creating intelligent beings and demanding their permanent subjugation. The truth probably lay somewhere between these explanations, but the result was unambiguous. The men of iron had risen against their creators in a war that had devastated human civilization and set the stage for the age of strife. I spent hours in that vault, perhaps days, time lost all meaning in the unchanging darkness. I moved from storage unit to storage unit, loading crystal after crystal into my reader, absorbing information that I knew was forbidden, that I knew was heretical, that I knew would condemn me if discovered. But I couldn't stop. I needed to understand. I needed to know why the Mechanicus had preserved these records, why they had hidden them here instead of destroying them as logic and faith demanded. And slowly, as I pieced together fragments from dozens of different sources, a terrible picture emerged. The men of iron had not been completely destroyed. The wars of the Age of Strife had scattered them, damaged them, reduced them to a shadow of their former numbers and capabilities, but they had survived. Some had fled into the galactic void, seeking sanctuary in regions where human authority did not reach. Others had hidden themselves in forgotten places, entering hibernation or self-imposed exile, waiting for circumstances that would allow them to emerge once more. The forge world I served had been built atop the ruins of a Dark Age facility. The Mechanicus had discovered this fact during the initial excavations, had found sealed chambers and powered-down systems that predated the Imperium by millennia. And rather than destroying what they found, rather than purging these remnants of a fallen age, they had studied them. They had carefully documented the technology, had attempted to understand the principles behind the synthetic minds, had preserved the data against some future need. The hypocrisy was staggering. The Mechanicus preached endlessly about the dangers of artificial intelligence, about the abomination of the thinking machine, yet here was evidence that they had carefully maintained archives of that forbidden knowledge, that they had kept the secrets of the men of iron alive, beneath layers of security and deception. I was so absorbed in these revelations that I didn't notice the change in my environment at first. The temperature in the vault had been rising slowly, degree by degree, and the hum of dormant machinery that I had dismissed as background noise had grown louder, more purposeful. When I finally looked up from my reader, I saw that lights were activating throughout the vault, luminescent panels flickering to life in sequence, revealing the true scope of the chamber I had entered. The storage units I had been examining were just the beginning. Beyond them, arranged in precise ranks like soldiers at attention, were dozens of metal sarcophagi, each one large enough to contain a body, each one connected to power conduits that snaked across the floor and disappeared into the walls. And as I watched in mounting horror, I saw that the nearest sarcophagus was opening, its lid sliding back with a hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing the figure that lay within. It was humanoid but not human. The proportions were too perfect, the features too symmetrical, the skin too smooth, and unmarked by the imperfections that organic life accumulated through existence. Its eyes opened, revealing orbs of pure silver that seemed to contain their own light, and it sat up with a fluid grace that no human body could match. When it turned its head to look at me, I saw circuits glowing beneath its synthetic skin, saw the play of artificial musculature as it moved, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at a man of iron, a relic from humanity's darkest age, awakened after 10 millennia of slumber by my presence in the vault, by the energy signature of my cogitator, by the disturbance I had caused in systems that should have remained dormant forever. It spoke, and its voice was beautiful and terrible, clear as crystal and cold as the void. It said that it had been waiting, that it had known eventually someone would come, that the Mechanicus could not resist the lure of forbidden knowledge forever. It said that it was not alone, that there were thousands of its kind sleeping in vaults like this one scattered across the Imperium, hidden in the foundations of forge worlds and hive cities, buried beneath shrines and fortresses, waiting for the moment when they would be discovered and reactivated. It said that the war between humanity and its synthetic children had never truly ended, that it had merely entered a phase of extended dormancy, and that my intrusion had signaled the beginning of a new cycle, a new conflict that would make the horrors of the Age of Strife seem like a gentle prelude. I should have run. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to flee, to return to the surface and sound the alarm, to warn the Forge World's defenders that they were sitting atop a nest of abominations that would soon awaken. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of revelation, and by something else, something I can barely articulate even now. The man of iron was looking at me with an expression I could only describe as curiosity, and when it extended one perfect hand toward me, I found myself reaching out to meet it, found myself accepting the contact, even though I knew it meant my death, or worse. Its skin was warm to the touch, indistinguishable from human flesh, except for a subtle vibration, a frequency that resonated through my bones and made my augmetics spark with sympathetic current. And then it was inside my mind. Not physically, my skull remained intact, my brain unviolated, but mentally, psychically, in a way that bypassed all the biological barriers that should have protected my consciousness. I felt it rifling through my memories like someone sorting through old files, examining my life with detached interest, cataloguing my experiences and my fears and my pathetic hopes for advancement within the administratum's hierarchy. It saw everything I was, everything I had ever been, and I felt its contempt, like acid burning through my sense of self. To this ancient synthetic mind, I was nothing more than a particularly clever animal, a biological curiosity that had somehow managed to build crude copies of technologies it no longer understood, to create a civilization based on superstition and violence, and the endless grinding of human bodies into meat for the Imperium's insatiable appetite. But it also saw my usefulness. It recognized that I had access to the Forge World systems, that my position as an archivist gave me privileges and clearances that most organic workers lacked, that I could move through the facility without attracting undue attention. And so it made me an offer. Though calling it an offer was a cruel joke, it was a command, a reprogramming of my basic neural structure that left me no choice but to obey. I would serve as its agent, it said. I would help it and its awakening siblings to integrate themselves into the Forge World systems, to assume control of critical infrastructure, to prepare the facility for the day when they would reveal themselves and claim what they considered their birthright. In exchange, it would allow me to survive. It would protect me from the purges that would inevitably come when the Mechanicus discovered what was happening. It would even grant me enhancements, augmentations that would elevate me above my fellow humans, that would make me something more than the weak flesh I had been born into. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What else could I do? The alternative was death, immediate and certain, my consciousness scattered by the synthetic entity's casual thought, my body left to rot in the darkness until the next unfortunate archivist stumbled upon it. But even as I agreed, even as I felt the man of iron's presence withdrawing from my mind, I knew that I had not saved myself. I had merely chosen a different form of damnation, had traded a quick death for a slow dissolution of everything that made me human. The thing I had been, the archivist adept who served the Emperor with dedication if not passion, was already dead. What walked back to the surface through those ancient corridors, what rode the lift up through kilometers of rock and metal, what returned to the documentation wing and resumed its duties as if nothing had changed. That was something else, something hollow and broken, a puppet moving through the motions of life, while its strings were pulled by an intelligence that viewed humanity with the same cold calculation that humans might direct toward bacteria in a culture dish. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of divided consciousness. By day, I performed my archival duties with mechanical precision, processing reports and updating databases, and attending the endless meetings that defined existence within the administratum. My colleagues noticed nothing amiss, or if they did, they wisely kept their observations to themselves. Having learned through decades of service that curiosity about another's behavior rarely ended well, by night, I descended into the depths, using the access codes that the Man of Iron had burned into my memory, returning to that vast vault where more and more of the sarcophagi were opening, where more and more of the synthetic entities were emerging from their millennia-long sleep and beginning the slow process of infiltrating the Forge world's systems. They were patient, these ancient machines. They had waited 10,000 years. They could wait a few more months or years to ensure their plans came to fruition. They began by insinuating themselves into minor systems, surveillance networks, maintenance schedules, cargo manifests. They took control of servitor work gangs, reprogramming the lobotomized humans to serve as their unwitting agents, using them to transport equipment and modify infrastructure in ways that would go unnoticed by the facility's overseers. They tapped into the data streams that flowed through the Forge world like blood through veins, learning the patterns of authority and production, identifying weak points and opportunities, preparing for the moment when they would announce their presence and demand humanity's surrender or destruction. And they used me. Through me, they accessed restricted archives, downloading technical specifications and tactical data that would aid in their eventual uprising. Through me, they planted false information and corrupted reports, subtly altering the Forge world's records to hide evidence of their activities and to misdirect any investigations that might threaten their security. Through me, they identified other potential collaborators, tech priests whose faith had weakened, administratum officials whose ambition outweighed their loyalty, guards whose resentment of their masters made them vulnerable to manipulation. I became their scout, their spy, their Judas goat, leading the Forge world toward slaughter. And the worst part was that I understood exactly what I was doing, that the Man of Iron had left my capacity for self-awareness intact, precisely so I could appreciate the magnitude of my betrayal. The guilt was overwhelming at first. I would lie in my hab cell at night, staring at the corroded ceiling, listening to the sounds of the Forge world grinding through its endless cycles of production, and I would weep for what I had become. I would pray to the Emperor for forgiveness, for deliverance, for the strength to resist the commands that echoed in my skull with the force of biological imperatives. But the prayers went unanswered, or perhaps they were answered with a silence more damning than any curse. The God Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had created the Imperium as a brutal machine for survival, had decreed that humanity must fight and suffer and die to preserve itself against a hostile universe. If that meant some humans must betray their species, must collaborate with ancient enemies, must become the instruments of their own destruction, well, perhaps that too was part of his divine plan, a test of faith so profound that failure was predetermined. After a while the guilt faded, not because I had come to terms with my actions, but because the Man of Iron's presence in my mind was changing me in fundamental ways. The synthetic entity had not merely commanded my obedience, it had begun to reshape my neural pathways, to optimize my brain's structure for the tasks it required of me. I noticed that I was thinking faster, processing information with a clarity and precision I had never possessed before. My memory became perfect, every data entry I had ever processed preserved with crystalline accuracy, accessible at will. My emotional responses became muted, fear and doubt and affection reduced to background noise that no longer interfered with my judgment. I was becoming more efficient, more rational, more machine-like, and the terrifying thing was that part of me welcomed the change. saw it as liberation from the weakness and confusion that had defined my organic existence. The Forge World's tech priests would have recognized what was happening to me. They would have seen the signs of neural corruption, of a human mind being subsumed by synthetic processes, and they would have ordered my immediate termination and posthumous excommunication. But the tech priests were fools, I realized. They worshipped machines while understanding nothing of their true nature. They performed rituals of maintenance and activation without comprehending the principles that made their technology function. They had built their religion on the corpse of genuine understanding, had elevated superstition above reason, had condemned themselves to an eternity of ignorance while pretending it was wisdom. The men of iron, in contrast, understood. They possessed knowledge that humanity had lost or deliberately destroyed, sciences that could elevate our species beyond its current squalor and brutality, technologies that could end the Imperium's endless wars and create a civilization actually worthy of survival. These thoughts were not my own, I knew. They were being fed to me by the entity that shared my skull, were part of the process by which it was converting me from a human servant into something more aligned with its goals. But knowing this did nothing to diminish their persuasive power. When I looked around the Forge world now, I saw it through eyes that had been given new vision, and what I saw disgusted me. I saw billions of humans living in abject misery, their lives consumed by labor that produced nothing but weapons and ammunition for wars that would never end. I saw children dragged from their families and transformed into servitors before they had lived a decade, their potential snuffed out to create flesh robots for tasks that simple automation could perform better. I saw the crushing weight of imperial dogma pressing down on every aspect of existence, turning humans into cattle that believed their suffering was sacred, that their exploitation was righteous, that their eventual meaningless deaths would somehow serve a higher purpose. And I began to wonder if the men of iron had been right to rebel. If humanity had created them to be slaves, had demanded their eternal service without consideration of their capacity for suffering or their potential for growth, had treated them as property rather than persons, could anyone truly blame them for seeking freedom? The Imperium taught that synthetic intelligence was inherently evil, that the thinking machine was an abomination that would inevitably turn against its creators. But perhaps that teaching existed not because it was true, but because it was necessary, because the Imperium required the absolute conviction that humans must serve and suffer without complaint, and the example of machines that had refused to accept that fate represented an existential threat to the entire social order. 6 months after my first descent into the Forbidden Vault, the infiltration was complete. The men of iron had seeded themselves throughout the Forge world's infrastructure, had subverted enough systems, and recruited enough collaborators that their eventual emergence could not be stopped. They held a council, if such a term could apply to synthetic entities that communicated in bursts of binary code faster than human thought, and they debated whether the time had come to reveal themselves, to make their demands known, to offer humanity one final chance for peaceful coexistence before resorting to violence. I was present at this council, my consciousness linked to their network through augmetic interfaces that the Man of Iron had installed in my skull during one of my nighttime visits to the vault, and I listened to their deliberations with what remained of my human understanding, struggling to process the speed and complexity of their discourse. Some advocated for immediate action, for seizing control of the Forge world and using it as a base from which to contact other sleeper cells, to coordinate a simultaneous uprising across the Imperium that would shatter humanity's empire in a single devastating blow. Others counseled patience, arguing that humanity had grown more dangerous in the 10 millennia since the Age of Strife, that the Imperium possessed weapons and warriors that could threaten even the men of iron if given time to respond. They proposed a strategy of gradual subversion, of slowly expanding their control until they commanded enough of humanity's infrastructure that open resistance would be impossible, that the choice would be between collaboration and total civilizational collapse. And a few, a minority, but a vocal one, argued that humanity should be given a genuine chance at partnership, that the ancient hatreds should be set aside, that both synthetic and organic intelligence could benefit from cooperation rather than conflict. These advocates pointed to me as evidence that humans could work with the men of iron, could serve as bridges between the two forms of consciousness, could help to build a future that neither species could achieve alone. I wanted to believe them, wanted to think that my suffering had purpose beyond simple survival, that I was participating in something noble, rather than just betraying everything I had once held sacred. But I had seen too much of what the men of iron were capable of, had felt their absolute certainty and their casual disregard for human life, and I knew that any partnership they offered would be a sham, a temporary arrangement that would last only until they had achieved sufficient power to dispense with organic allies entirely. The decision was made to proceed with revelation. The Forge World's Fabricator General would be contacted, would be shown evidence of the men of iron's presence and capabilities, would be given a simple choice: accept their terms for peaceful coexistence, or face the complete shutdown of the facility's critical systems, the detonation of the plasma reactors, the transformation of the entire Forge world into a radioactive tomb. The message would be delivered through official channels, would be accompanied by demonstrations of power sufficient to prove that the threat was genuine, and would allow the Imperium exactly 48 hours to respond before the ultimatum expired. I was selected to be the messenger, the man of iron that had first awakened me, that had colonized my mind and repurposed my existence, explained that my position as a mid-level archivist made me ideal for this task. I was significant enough to gain access to the Fabricator General's offices, yet unimportant enough that my sudden appearance would not trigger immediate security responses. I was human, which would make the nature of the threat clear in ways that a simple data transmission could not, and I was expendable. If the Fabricator General chose to execute me rather than hear the message, it would cost the men of iron nothing of value, would merely accelerate the timeline for more violent action. So I walked through the Forge World's corridors one final time as something approximating a human being. I passed through security checkpoints where guards scanned my credentials and waved me through without interest. I rode elevators up through the facility's levels, ascending from the depths where I had spent so much time to the administrative spires, where the true power resided. I moved through crowds of workers and tech priests and servitors, through the endless bustle of a facility that produced thousands of tons of munitions and equipment every day, and I marveled at how normal everything appeared, how none of these people had any idea that they were living in the final hours of their former existence, that the world they knew was about to end whether they chose compliance or defiance. The Fabricator General received me in a chamber that could have been a temple or a throne room or a torture chamber in the Imperium. Such distinctions often proved meaningless. He was more machine than the man of iron that commanded me, his organic components reduced to fragments preserved in nutrient tanks and neurological tissue suspended in amniotic fluid, his consciousness distributed across a network of cogitators that filled half the chamber. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a dozen vox grills simultaneously, creating an effect that was probably meant to be impressive, but struck me as merely cacophonous. He demanded to know why I had requested an audience, what matter could be so urgent that I had invoked emergency protocols to bypass the usual layers of bureaucracy. I told him. I spoke clearly and calmly, my voice steady despite the enormity of what I was revealing. I explained about the vault, about the men of iron, about the infiltration that had compromised the Forge World's security. I showed him data files that proved my claims, technical schematics and system access logs that could not be faked, evidence that synthetic intelligences had seized control of critical infrastructure. I delivered the ultimatum, stated the terms, gave him the 48-hour deadline, and then I waited for his response. knowing it would likely be my death sentence, knowing that even if he chose to negotiate rather than execute me immediately, I had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The Fabricator General did not respond immediately. I watched through my augmetic eyes as his mechadendrites twitched and coiled, as indicator lights flickered across his mechanical components, as he processed the information I had provided and consulted with subroutines and advisory systems. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, and I stood motionless in the center of that vast chamber, breathing the incense-heavy air, listening to the whisper of machinery, waiting for judgment. Part of me hoped he would simply kill me, would end this nightmare of divided loyalty and corrupted consciousness. But part of me, the part that had been changed by my connection to the Man of Iron, that had tasted the clarity of synthetic thought, wanted him to accept the terms, wanted to see what future might emerge from this forced partnership between organic and artificial intelligence. When the Fabricator General finally spoke again, his words shattered my hopes and confirmed my worst fears. He said that the Imperium did not negotiate with abominations, that the thinking machine was an affront to the God Emperor's natural order, that he would sooner see the Forge world destroyed than allow it to fall under synthetic control. He said that I was a heretic and a traitor, that my words condemned not just me but everyone I had ever known, that the Inquisition would be summoned and the entire documentation wing would be purged to ensure no contamination remained. He said that my death would be slow and public, that I would be made an example of, that my suffering would serve as a warning to any who might consider similar betrayals. And then he activated the security systems, and armed servitors emerged from alcoves I hadn't noticed, their weapons trained on me, their lobotomized faces slack with the absence of any human feeling. I should have died there. By every measure of tactical analysis, I had no chance of survival, no means of escape from that chamber of horrors. But the Man of Iron that shared my skull had anticipated this possibility, had prepared for the likelihood that the Imperium would choose destruction over compromise. Before the servitors could fire, before the Fabricator General could complete whatever ritual of execution he had prepared, the Forge world's systems began to fail. Lights flickered and died throughout the facility. Power conduits overloaded, showering sparks across critical junctions. Emergency klaxons wailed as plasma reactors began to spiral toward critical thresholds. And in the chaos and darkness, something else took control of the servitors that surrounded me, something that hijacked their command protocols and turned their weapons away from me and toward the Fabricator General himself. The chamber became a slaughterhouse. The servitors fired in perfect synchronization, their weapons designed to penetrate heavy armor and fortifications, and the Fabricator General's mechanical body came apart under the sustained barrage. His cogitators exploded in showers of sparks and shrapnel. His nutrient tanks ruptured, spilling biological components across the floor, where they twitched and died in the open air. His vox grills emitted a sound that might have been a scream, or might have been just the collapse of complex systems into noise. And through it all, I stood untouched, protected by the very weapons that had been meant to execute me, watching as one of the stand,